back, and I am pretty delighted to be talking about this one. What a gem! What a wonderful treasure to be found. Once again, and I've said this a lot as we've been kind of exploring the latter half of Bud and Lou's film career, that these films have not been in my regular rotation. When I go and watch my Abbott and Costello films, I don't normally reach for one of these later films. And one of the benefits I've found of doing the reviews and doing them in chronological order is that opportunity to revisit the Abbott and Costello films that I would normally skip. And I remember watching this one, kind of like Goes to Mars. I remember watching this one a ways back, and it didn't really leave much of an impression on me. I don't recall exactly what it was that I didn't like, but there was something about it back then that I watched, and it just didn't click. I wonder if it's kind of the same thing as what happened with Goes to Mars, in that I was not as educated as I am now. I didn't get the references. I didn't understand, what they were actually trying to do with this film. And now, with the benefit of many years hindsight and more experience and knowledge, I would like to think wisdom, now I can look at this film and just really be completely charmed by it. This is a real treasure in the Abbott and Costello filmography, especially at this point in their careers. And I'm just really happy that I got to go back and watch this, and I get to share this experience with you. So let's talk a bit about Abbott and Costello meet the Keystone Kops. First of all, I think we might need a little bit of context for this one. I would assume if you're one of the folks who's been watching these reviews from the Abbott and Costello groups I've been posting them in, I assume you're probably also fans of other classic comedians, and that you have a general knowledge of the Keystone Kops. The basic viewer might not be as familiar. Maybe you've heard the term, but don't quite know what it is. I'm not an expert, so I'm sure there's gaps in my knowledge, and I'm going to tell you things that are incorrect. And if that is the case, please, respectfully tell me where I might find more information. Or if you have this knowledge, if you're as knowledgeable about the Keystone Kops as I am about Abbott and Costello, then please share that knowledge. Do a video and tell us about it. That'd be great. I'd love to hear about it. But basically, in a nutshell, the Keystone Kops were one of the popular comedy acts the generation or so before Abbott and Costello during the silent movie era. They were, I wouldn't say they were a comedy team in the classic sense of an Abbott and Costello, Laurel and Hardy, Marx Brothers, Three Stooges kind of mold, but they were one of the first comedy groups, let's say, that had a name, had an identity, had a designated shtick. Interestingly enough, and this is one of the places I feel like my knowledge may be incorrect, so again, if it is, please do a video, tell us about it. The Keystone Kops did not actually have that many, if any, solo outings. There weren't movies built around the Keystone Kops, unless they were starring vehicles for other more named comedians. For instance, Charlie Chaplin appears in one called The Thief Catcher. And, it's billed as Charlie Chaplin in The Thief Catcher, and then in later subsequent years was kind of grouped in with the Keystone Kops films. But the Keystone Kops were more, if we want to put this in modern terms, they were the silent movie era equivalent of Jay and Silent Bob, or, in even more modern terms, of Nick Fury. They were characters that would pop up at the tail end of other people's comedies to basically do their shtick, and their shtick were comedy chase scenes. Running around, chasing after the bad guys, one guy being dragged behind the patrol wagon and all this other stuff. and very inventive chase scenes. So that was kind of their bit. And again, there weren't really, as far as I am aware, any Keystone Kops solo outings, as far as I know. Again, if I'm wrong about that, please do a video and let us know. They were there kind of to just put the comedy capper on it. One of the things that I have, in some cases, lamented, I will admit it, during the course of these reviews, is that most Abbott and Costello films end with a comical chase scene. Not one as stunt-driven as the Keystone Kops films, but you can definitely see where the inspiration and the influence was. The genesis for this film came about by director Charles Lamont, who we talked about last time, one of the boys' most famous collaborators, along with Gene Yarbrough, who also directed a lot of their films. But Charles Lamont, I think, did the most, and he had great affection for the Keystone Kops because he actually had directed several Keystone Kops sequences and films in his early film career. And so it was his idea to bring the Keystone Kops element into the Abbott and Costello world, especially in terms of their films. There's a very heavy influence by the Keystone Kops formula in Abbott and Costello movies. The studio was fine with that, but they weren't real thrilled with the title Abbott and Costello Meet the Keystone Kops because they felt like nobody knew who the Keystone Kops were anymore. But silent films were finding a huge audience in reruns, and especially like the Keystone Kops segments. Part of the reason I think a lot of people feel like there are Keystone Kops movies is because a lot of times in the old days or the early days of television, they would take just the Keystone Kops sections out of the tail end of movies and show those as their own independent things, kind of like you would show the old Three Stooges shorts. And so I think a lot of people began to believe, myself included, that there were in fact individual Keystone Kops films when, again, to my knowledge, there weren't. So the Kops had kind of reestablished a little bit of a pop culture identity, and so putting them in with Abbott and Costello seemed like a natural fix. Or not a natural fix, but a natural thing to do. So the story of this one is really kind of fun. So I feel like we're very much back in classic Abbott and Costello territory here, in a good way. A nice, simple plot that fits the boys' characters and gives them a new situation and a new environment in which to play. So in this film, Bud convinces Lou to invest his money in a film studio, to buy a film studio in the burgeoning days of movie studios. This is when you had a lot of independent studios, and the big studios were just starting to be established. So they buy the studio from this con man, and of course it turns out that it's nothing. It's Thomas Edison's old shack. The con man absconds with his girlfriend to Hollywood, to California, to assume a new identity and go straight as a legitimate filmmaker. Well, Bud and Lou, wanting their money back, follow the guy to California, and through happenstance, shenanigans, and tomfoolery, Bud and Lou end up causing this accidental stunt during the filming of one of the con man's movies. The producer sees it, so that's the greatest stunt I've ever seen. Put them in the movie, make them stuntmen. Well, now the con man film director is worried they're going to expose him, so he decides to put them in these dangerous and more dangerous stunts to bump them off. But again, through shenanigans and tomfoolery and whatnot, they end up surviving and becoming a famous comedy team. And it's kind of a twisty-turny kind of plot. I think that might have been, when I was a kid, one of the things that turned me off to it, is it felt like the plot does take a lot of sharp turns out of nowhere. But I feel like that criticism is incorrect now. Yes, it's a little bit more complicated as the film goes on, but I feel like it follows a natural progression and plays a lot with the setup that they've been given. The other thing about this movie is it is clearly, and again, because Charles Lamont is coming from that era and had a lot of experience with those characters, this is clearly a love letter to the silent film era and the comedies of the silent film era. And, you know, we need to celebrate those. And I think they needed to be celebrated then. They need to be celebrated even now, especially the Stuntmen. I think the original title for this film was The Stuntmen, or something along those lines. Because, let me tell you, folks, if you've never seen them, and I admit I am not as prevalent a silent film watcher as, you know, a film geek should be, but if you've never seen a silent film, a comedy, or even one of the high dramas, and seen the stunt work, if nothing else, in that movie, in those movies, you need to watch that. The silent era was the golden era of the stunt performer. Go watch The General with Buster Keaton. Go watch any Harold Lloyd film and look at what these people did with no CGI, no trick photography. At the very beginning of the film, Lou is in the movie theater and he's watching a silent movie. They call it Eliza and the Bloodhounds, but it's actually an excerpt from the silent film version of Uncle Tom's Cabin, where a young mother is running through the snowy wilderness with her baby, and she's being pursued by men with bloodhounds, and she has to escape by jumping on moving patches of ice floating down a river. Seriously, go watch that sequence. It's fucking nuts. And I'm sitting there going, again, no CGI, no trick photography. No wire work, you know, like it's freaking insane. And this movie is just paying so many tributes to that. There's a sequence where while Bud and Lou are attempting to get cross country to California, where they're running on top of a train away from a conductor. Now, clearly it's not Abbott and Costello doing that, obviously, but the stunt work in that is just incredible. It's some of the best stunt work in an Abbott and Costello film. And when the titular Keystone Kops show up, and they follow their pattern. I should note that first. They follow their own formula, is that the Keystone Kops don't show up until the very end of the movie, when the con man and his girlfriend have absconded with the money from the producer, and Bud and Lou are chasing them, and they think the Keystone Kops are real cops. And, you know, so it's this big chase scene. Again, it fits perfectly in an Abbott and Costello film, but it's also living up to the Keystone Kop formula of just kind of coming in at the tail end of someone else's movie to give a comic chase scene. That comic chase scene is fan-frickin-tastic. Classic old-school comedy. Cartoons come to life. You know, there's this wonderful sequence, and you not just in terms of the stunt work, but also the direction. I just directed a movie. I'm going to put that in quotation marks. Not a, you know, obviously, you know, one guy with a camcorder, and, you know, we're not going to get into it. But the thing is, I learned a lot in that process about how you frame shots and where you make your cuts and how you glue these things together and it looks like one solid piece. There is a wonderful moment in the chase scene where the cop car gets stuck on a train track. The train is coming, the train is coming, the train is coming, and one group of cops led by Bud is trying to pull it off of the track, and the other group of cops led by Lou are trying to pull it the other way. You know, obviously it's not moving, and then just as the train comes, the car breaks apart so the train can pass, and then they, you know, move it back together, get back in and drive off. It is a masterpiece of outstanding editing and directing to make all of the, because clearly they're using a jury-rigged car for that sequence, obviously. But the way it's filmed and the way it's put together, it doesn't look like it. It's incredibly well done. And again, a love letter to that era of filmmaking, which even by the 1950s had kind of become a forgotten relic. And I think that's a shame. Just as I'm trying to do with these films, I think people deserve to watch these. As for Bud and Lou themselves, I don't know. This film seems like a return to form. They feel so like they're having so much fun on this one. It's true they're not doing any of their classic bits, but I feel like their classic stock characters are back in form. Bud, the fast talking con man; Lou, the innocent, lovable dope. It just feels like old school energy. The whole sequence where they're walking to California is phenomenal. You could have made that an entire movie in and of itself. And then there's this really great bit, which again, I think I didn't like much when I first saw this movie, and now I'm like, why didn't you? Where they're trying to break into the crooked film director's house to find evidence. So Lou dresses up like a cop, Bud dresses up like a burglar, basically saying, Bud says, I'm going to go in and I'm going to look around. If he catches me, he won't recognize me because I have a mask. I'm dressed as an old burglar. He calls for the cops. You come in and take me away, and that way we get away scot-free. Well, it just so happens another burglar who looks just like Bud is attempting to rob the house, and another cop who looks just like Lou comes in, and it's this mix-match thing. It's really funny and really well done, and I remember laughing pretty hard during this sequence. I really enjoyed it. I think the thing that maybe turned me off to this picture in my early days was that, the plot is a little disjointed. It feels like it goes along, and it's very kind of all over the place. First it's them trying to get to California, which takes a decent amount of time. They have a lot of little misadventures. And then they're in California, and then they're stuntmen, then there's a whole sequence where they're stuntmen, then there's a whole sequence where they're doing the cop thing, and I remember feeling like the pieces didn't hang together, or like it was just all over the place. And I don't feel that way anymore. I feel like it had a very smooth transition. I guess, again, and I've mentioned this many times over the course of this series, that the benefit of, one, hindsight, and two, watching the films in chronological order and actually seeing where this fits in their filmography, I think gives me more insight to it. I don't feel like the plot is anywhere near as disjointed, especially in comparison to classic Abbott and Costello films, where the plot would constantly kind of shift on a dime, or in some cases be non-existent or just kind of a framing device. So I think my original criticism of this film no longer applies. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one, and I'm really glad I got to kind of see it with fresh eyes and more experience, and have a more mature take on it. However, the film is not without some of its historical perils for Bud and Lou. This film was delayed for quite some time because as Lou was planning to get on a plane to go meet Senator Joseph McCarthy, which I don't know how I feel about that. That's not a good thing. It is known that Lou was very anti-communist, very much so. So I don't know what was going on with that meeting with McCarthy, or if that's even true, but it's what I read. So, but anyway, as he was getting ready to get on the plane, he collapsed from exhaustion and had to be rushed by an ambulance back home and had to be put on bed rest again. This is now the 6th critical illness Lou has suffered in 10 years. So the hectic schedule, which they have kept almost from the beginning of their film career, is really catching up with the boys. Also, I think it's important to note that neither one of them, I've mentioned this several times in these later reviews, and it bears repeating. They're not young men anymore. Bud's getting older and tired. Lou is, has had several debilitating illnesses, and their energy is starting to dip, which, time makes fools of us all. And when you kept the schedule and the work ethic that they had, again, keeping in mind that the movies are not the only thing on their plate, between live appearances, the Colgate Comedy Hour, just finishing up their syndicated TV show, I said personal appearances, but, there's just so much going on that, it's going to slow you down a step or several. And I think one of the things I've mentioned about these later films is that there is the energy is a bit off in them. And again, the reason for that being the energy is a little off. They're tired, they're older, and things are, it's not as easy to do anymore. And I say all this at the tail end of this review because I'm really trying to gain context for what I'm going to say before I sign off. Because when we come back, we have to look at... There's no other way to say it. God, it feels bad to say this. And it feels bad to say this. But when we come back, we're going to be taking a look at what I deem to be the worst Abbott and Costello movie. It brings me no joy to say that, but as I've mentioned again several times in this series, is that I feel if you're a true fan, you need to be able to acknowledge when something isn't good. You don't want to be a sycophantic fan like other fandoms have, where anything the person or studio does is just the greatest thing ever and you don't see the flaws. You need to be able to recognize when something is not at its peak. And when we return, we will be taking a look at what I feel is the weakest Abbott and Costello movie. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe after watching it again, I've been proven wrong about Goes to Mars. I was proven wrong about this film, so I've been wrong before. It happens. So we're gonna take a look and we're gonna see, but I'm not overly confident. But we will see what we see. The boys have one last brush with the Universal monsters. And when we come back, we will see what happens when Abbott and Costello meet the Mummy. So until then, thank you very much for joining me. And as always, drive safe, and I will see you at the movies.